Refined question list for pedagogical bridging. Structural bridging questions. On the second order and third order problem. In classical Jung, the types are the 8 psychological functions, second order. Not necessarily, no, not necessarily, because he made a point to describe the principal and auxiliary functions in terms of adaptation and compensation. He never talked about a specific function as the type, except in his general descriptions of the types, where he was talking about the function itself and then the function type. But at the end, he talked about the principal and the auxiliary function, which stands for the theoretical baseline of what MBTI, the Myers-Briggs typology indicator, brought forth, or the 16 personality types, what they brought forth. In classical Jung, the types are the 8 psychological functions, the second order. In OPS, those are just components. The real types are defined by animal stacks, the third and fourth order. This is confusing for people switching between systems. Explain clearly, are these 2 different ways of looking at the same person, or are Jung and OPS literally typing different things? What would it look like if you typed someone in both systems? Would you get compatible or contradictory answers? Okay, here's the thing. From the perspective of objective personality, those 8 functions no longer exist. It's only 16 psychological functions because they're taking a splitter's perspective. So on the second versus third order problem, the problem is there are 2 pieces of intellectual property that objective personality brings forth. The first is the split between the 8 psychological functions that Jung brought forth into 16 based on a masculine and feminine modality anchoring. And they're saying that that anchoring produces better results, produces the only results that we can actually type when we're identifying psychological functions within people. We cannot define a psychological function in a peer without giving it the characterization of having a modality. So what this means is that from there, you get 16 functions, and you get a permutation of however many that computes to. 8 or 16 types times 4. 16 times 4 is 64. And that is the new permutation of static grant function types. So if we're thinking about this just in terms of MBTI, 16 personalities, and classic orthodox Jungian theory, then we would say that we have 64 types. We have 64 permutations of a grant function stack that would be like what the 16 psychological types are in MBTI, just as a reflection of most differentiated to least differentiated. There are 64 versions of those quote-unquote bundles of functions. Where objective personality goes another layer, so again, we're talking about 2 distinct intellectual property achievements. The first is the splitter's perspective. I know it's not super hard to come up with it if you're framing it that way. Oh, it was just the splitter's perspective. Well, no, they went through the technique, and I'm backwards rationalizing it in terms of theory, because I don't have enough data necessarily to say, okay, well, this is because Jung went in and went in with the theoretical characterization of like, okay, no, you have an attitude orientation and a function of consciousness. In this context, we're saying a modality is required, it's necessary, and it's also a characterization of the function itself. So that function is not just the function, it's a masculine version, it's a feminine version of that function. And what happens to the other function? Well, it's in the unconscious. It's in somebody else. Where is that other function if it's not in the ego? That's what we seek to figure out in terms of theory. So that's the first layer. That's the second order problem. Is that we go from 8 psychological functions to 16 psychological types in MBTI and 16 personalities. What is different here is that the first bit of intellectual property brings in sexual modalities. What that means is that the function is characterized by a masculine modality or a feminine modality. So this is what it means to characterize the concept of a psychological function from a splitter's perspective. So what that means combinatorically is that now instead of just 8 psychological functions, we have 16, and instead of 16 psychological types. So instead of 8 psychological functions, now you have 16 psychological functions because they took a splitter's perspective in terms of this lumper versus splitters characterization in theory of science, in philosophy of science. And then we move, okay, so that's 8 to 16. 8 psychological functions, 16 psychological functions. And then we move from 16 psychological types to 64 psychological types. Why? Because of the combinatorics of that split with the grant function stack creates all of those permutations. Because you can have FM, FM, MM, FM, FF, MF, MM, MF, FF. So we're talking about MF, FM, MF, FM, FF, MM. So those are the 4. MM is 1, FF is 2, MF is 3, FM is 4. And those are the different permutations when you're talking about formal notation in the context of reading out a psychological type. You begin with the extroverted, you begin with sensory. Is that sensory function? Is that sensory? What is going on with the sensory? Is the sensory masculine or is it feminine? That gives you the first character. And then what's going on with the extroverted decider? What's going on with the extroverted judgment function? If the extroverted judgment function is masculine, then it's masculine. If it's feminine, then it's feminine. And then you put both characters together, and that's how you get that notation in terms of formal notation. But in terms of common notation, there's also ways to describe a singular animal function based on its modality. And we get to that later on. This is confusing for people switching between systems. Explain clearly, are these 2 different ways of looking at the same person? So we got to 64 types. That would be core MBTI, core 16 personalities. But then they take it a step further and they add animal function stacks. And as a higher order combinatoric, that means for our example, we said in the objective personality system, we're using MF. So that's feminine FE, masculine SI, feminine NE, masculine TI. So that could be, that's a specific function stack. That's a grant function stack. Feminine FE, masculine SI, feminine NE, masculine TI. That's a function stack. But then they're saying that there's a higher order combinatoric based on the attitude, the animal functions, which it acts as an attitude orientation, meaning blast, play, sleep, consume. That means it's 1 to 2 for blast. That means it's 1 to 3 for play. That means it's 2 to 4 for sleep. And that means it's 3 to 4 for consume. Blast, play, sleep, consume. And there are 8 different permutations of the animal functions. I'll read them all off. Blast, play, sleep, consume. Blast, sleep, play, consume. Blast, play, consume, sleep. Blast, sleep, consume, play. Play, blast, sleep, consume. Play, blast, consume, sleep. Play, consume, blast, sleep. And play, consume, sleep, blast. So we officially have to multiply 64 by 8. And then you get 512. And so we're not ready to get into social types yet. We're just anchoring the linguistics, the concepts based on the theory, the structure, and the applications / practice. We're focusing on theory right now and making a case for first order versus second order problem. Explain clearly, are these 2 different ways of looking at the same person, or are Jung and OPS literally typing different things? They are literally typing different things, because we went from 8 to 16 functions, and that made it, if the grant function stack stays static, and that's all that we look at, that's 64 different types. And then they add a higher order combinatoric because they're linking psychological functions together based on a libido string. I don't know the theory exactly for it, but each is connected as a measure of differentiation. And they're testing for that ability to itemize that association, because up and down the grant function stack, they're able to sense, okay, this person is using blast, this person's using play, this person's using sleep, this person's using consume. And it's moving in that directionality in terms of their life problems, in terms of how they're using coins, in terms of most to least differentiated. Most to least differentiated. So these are 2 different ways of looking at the same person. 2 different ways, because it's the original system, orthodox Jungian psychological types, is operating at a lower level of linguistic resolution. What would it look like if you typed someone in both systems? Would you get compatible or contradictory answers? Well, based on what I've said previously, if you divide 512 by 64 or divide 512 by 16, you're going to get a different reading, because they don't have the degrees of freedom to be able to track what a projective personality is attempting to instantiate that they're tracking. They're attempting to project this tracking metric as a reflection of their technique. All of this is backwards rationalized downstream of technique. They're saying we have a technique for typing people. Based on this mechanism of action, we've determined the theory is as follows. So I'm backwards rationalizing the theory based on what the technique espouses. Now you can say the theory is wrong. You can say the technique is insufficient. You can say all of these things. But I'm just trying to explain to you the system and how it works as a reflection of the information at my disposal based on how I understand the system to work in terms of its mechanisms of action and how it relates to orthodox Jungian theory. So let me read the question again. On the second order versus third order problem. In classical Jung, the types are the 8 psychological functions, the second order. In OPS, those are just components. The real types are defined by animal stacks, third or fourth order. This is confusing for people switching between systems. Explain clearly, are these two different ways of looking at the same person, or are Jung and OPS literally typing different things? What would it look like if you typed someone in both systems? Would you get comparable or contradictory answers? So there you have it. You would get contradictory answers because the degrees of freedom that objective personality has are more complex than the degrees of freedom that MBTI or orthodox Jungian psychological functions has in relation to the 16 personality types. Why? I explained that previously. We're going from 8 to 16 psychological functions, and then if you doubled it based on modality, that would be 64 grant function stacks. And then when you multiply that based on animal function combinatorics in terms of the permutations of functions relating to each other, then you multiply that by 8 and you get 512. So there you have it. On the second order versus third order problem.